that. So let me do that, and we're off.
Yeah,
so
come up. You're recording it.
We're done. Prof and Bruce, thanks so much for joining us tonight for this two-part series. We're all going to be the best of mates by the end of tomorrow. I'm really jazzed about being able to see these back vintages in this way. I think that having tasted Majella wines for such a long time, the one thing, and I spoke about this with Prof the last time we drank together, was just amazing performance over time. They just seem to unfurl and evolve and really have a fantastic representation way longer. And I've actually made notes today of what your cellaring call originally was for all of these wines, Bruce, based on the winery website. And I absolutely bet that they're going to overshoot your call by quite a lot, if I remember the last time I looked at these older wines. So that's going to be super interesting to have a look at. So if I've got my history right, 1991 was the first year that you planted the vines or produced the...
No. So let's go back and look, before we go any further, for those that have joined us, to introduce Bruce as well. Many of you know me because I won't bloody shut up, and I keep coming, I used to keep coming to Singapore every fourth week. Bruce Gregory is with us. Bruce has been our winemaker forever, and every bottle of Majella you've ever drunk was made by Bruce. So the brief history, and Bruce will get his say in a minute, the brief history was that my father and mother purchased the property that we're on now in 1960. We started planting grapes there in 1968. By 1974, we'd put in about, in acre terms, about 80 acres. And then we had a hiatus because the wine industry sort of crashed in the 70s and early 80s. And then we started planting again in 1989, and we planted 150 acres by a few years ago. And then last year we went a bit crazy and planted another 10 acres, and we're planting 10 acres this year, which will give us 170 acres or 70 hectares or something like that of vines. But 91, Robert, was the first vintage of Majella, first commercial vintage.
Gotcha.
Made by Bruce. Bruce was working at Brand's winery, Brand's Lera.
Yep.
At the time. He came there in 89, Bruce, I think. 89?
Yes, that's right. Yes, 89.
And, so did you release the Shiraz and the Cabernets as single varietals straight up, or did you just start with the Cabernet and the Malaya? What was the process in terms of your product line?
We started with the Shiraz.
Really? That's interesting.
Well, see, a couple of things. One is I always love Coonawarra Shiraz. I know everyone knows about Cabernet. But you know, Robert. I love Shiraz. And basically, there was a bit of politics involved. We had contracts with one of the big wineries, and so we were sneaking a bit of fruit off. If we took some Cabernet, 10 tonne of Cabernet out, they might have noticed it, but we thought we'll sneak off 10 tonne of Shiraz. And they wouldn't notice it. We made Shiraz in 91 and 92 and 93. And then in 94, we took 10 tonne of Shiraz and 10 tonne of Cabernet. Malaya didn't turn up until when, Bruce? 96?
96, yes, that's right.
And back in the early 90s was the presumption that seems to still prevail certainly on the consumer side of the industry. Was it always about Coonawarra Cabernet even then, or had things evolved over time in terms of the predominance of the popularity of Coonawarra Cabernet as opposed to Shiraz?
Bruce, your comment.
Oh, yeah, no, certainly in the 90s there was a push for Cabernet Sauvignon. That was the thing. People were following the French style of winemaking with regards to blends. So there's a lot of Bordeaux blends. That was, the Cabernet Merlot, Cabernet Franc blends. That was really the big thing. So Shiraz took a bit of a dive, and it was really everybody wanted Cabernet. So that's what we saw, and we followed that trend a little bit as well with regards to what we were doing with our Cabernet. And obviously the Malaya was an Australian blend, being Cabernet Shiraz, and we sort of kept with those styles and followed the same style of winemaking all the way through.
Okay.
But you got to remember, Robert, Coonawarra was first planted in 1891, so that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And obviously Shiraz was one of the varieties back then that was planted. Shiraz has been planted in Australia for a long time. Cabernet is a relatively modern phenomenon.
So
really,
interesting.
there were no significant vineyards of Cabernet Sauvignon until about 1960, 1961.
Uh-huh.
And in 1960, I remember seeing a press clipping that said that Wynn's Coonawarra estate, which was then owned by the Wynn family, had planted 30 or 40 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon, which meant they had 60 or 70 acres of it, which was the largest Cabernet Sauvignon planting in Australia.
Good heavens.
You've got to remember some of these things are relatively new. I went to a seminar in 1974 in Ballarat, and one of the papers on emerging varieties from the late Alan Antcliffe, who was Dr. Alan Antcliffe. He was an ampelographer.
What the hell's that?
There you are. That's good in a quiz game. What is an ampelographer?
Yeah.
Stephen, do you know what an ampelographer is?
Absolutely not. No. So tell me.
An ampelographer is the scientist who can identify grapevines.
Ah.
I mean,
what, by looking at them?
Wow.
Well, basically by looking at the leaf, the colour, the structure, the lobes. Has it got 2 lobes, 3 lobes? The vein structure, and of course, bunch. A bunch that goes out.
That's a good question for a wine quiz.
Definitely.
The very best question for a wine quiz, Stephen.
I'll never be able to spell it though. That's for sure.
I've worked with a couple in the days when we were really a lot of vine improvement schemes happening. So we had mother plantings of a particular variety, and we had to make sure that all that variety was there. Walking through the vineyard in January or February with an ampelographer, spotting different grapes. I remember going through a Pinot Noir vineyard and finding some Pinot Meunier, because I think Pinot Noir is a sport of Pinot Meunier, and so there was a reversion to some Meunier ones, which we then had to pull out.
Right.
So anyway, to go back to what I was saying, in the list of varieties that Alan Antcliffe thought would do well in Australia, one was Merlot. In 1974, there were 3 vines of Merlot in Australia, and they were at the Nuriupta Research Centre on Research Road, Newry. That's all 3 vines of Merlot in 1974.
Geez, that's not so long ago. Yeah, that's crazy.
We keep thinking that these things have been around forever, but they really haven't. I mean, and even this whole wine thing is so much of an explosion. I was at a barbecue in the Barossa a couple of years ago and ran into a good old mate of mine and a mate of Bruce's. And he said when he left Roseworthy, which I would imagine would have been in the early 60s, there were 65 wineries in Australia.
Fair few more now.
I don't know what's there now, 2,000, 3,000, I don't know. Everyone decides to have a winery and a wine label. And when Tony, my brother, and I went planting vineyards in 1968, we were frowned upon by our peers. We were looked down by our peers. We were sheep farmers and cattle farmers, and they sort of looked down on us joining the dirt farmers. The Italians and the Greeks. I mean, it was not. Viticulture was not a noble occupation.
Well, how times have changed.
And I imagine Bruce, when Bruce started in the industry, Bruce, it wasn't all that fashionable, was it?
Oh, no, not at all. It was actually probably the worst time for me to start. It was when the vine pull was happening in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
So it was really doom and gloom for the wine industry at that stage in the early 80s and towards late 70s, early to mid-80s, when the vine pull scheme was in its full swing. So, yeah, we've seen some tough times in Australia when it comes to what's happening, riding the big waves and
yeah, absolutely. So to get Bruce, to get to these three wines now, how would you encapsulate, if you were to compare just like textually the 6, 13 and 14 together, how do the performance of those three vintages contrast to each other?
From a vintage point of view, there's not a huge amount of difference. You know, some are cooler. When I say some, the 06 was slightly cooler, but not a huge amount. I know people talk of odds and even vintages in the 90s. Used to be. Now when we're looking at these wines, we're really getting, most vintages are fairly warm and fairly controlled. So we don't have the peaks and troughs that we used to have with some of the vintages. So 13 and 14, 14 was probably the warmest one we had, was a shorter vintage. But again, cropping levels were very, very similar between 13, 14 and 06. The dates for picking, I cannot remember the dates we picked.
Well, they say your 14 was the longest vintage in history. So you went from February to May.
Yep, for Coonawarra.
Yeah, for Coonawarra, which is just a humongous period of time. And that was but certainly drier than 14, because 14 was that incredibly wet year for you guys. They say that the rainfall on average, I don't know about Coonawarra, but if I'm looking at the average report, there was twice the amount of the average rainfall that year, which is a humongous amount of water.
But then that's back in the winter time, you see, and you know, what worries us is not the amount of water we get in the middle of winter. You know, we can get swamps and floods and everything like that. I mean, not that we won't flood it, it's swampy. It's what's happening once we start harvest or coming up to harvest. Right. You know, you've got that ripening period where we don't need much rain. We don't want any rain at all. We don't want any rain once we start harvest. Right. So long as they're dry, then we're pretty good.
A lot of winemakers go about this notion of that 6-week period, say, for harvest. The key criteria are evenness. You want a cooler night and a warm-ish day, but not terribly hot, so you don't blow the alcohol and the Beaumay up, right? So it's just a question about soothing harmony for that 6-week period. And that's hard in the Australian climate, to pray for 6 weeks of even weather every bloody day.
No, I'd certainly agree with that. You want physiological ripeness out of the grapes. So, and that's why they look for a long, slow ripening period. When you say long and slow, 6 weeks is a pretty good time. So you want the berries to be an even size. In an ideal world, that sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't because of flowering. You want it to be a quick flowering, so all the berries are going to be the same size. They're going to ripen at the same time. Right. You want cool nights, so the vine can recover from the warm days. And then you just want, if you're not going to get really, really hot weather, then you can predict the flavour profile through the analysis we do in the lab with regards to acids and sugar levels. So the concentration of sugar being Beaumay. When we can pick the ideal Beaumay, we can see how the acid's dropping, and at one point in time, we can actually get the flavour profile we want out of our grapes. Okay. It has been slightly harder as it gets a little bit warmer, because sometimes your sugar goes up before you get physiological ripeness. Right. But again, getting back to the 13 and 14 and 06, we're sort of fairly lucky. And when you talk of, as Brian said before, it's when you get the rain. We don't want summer rainfall. We actually want rainfall during the winter time. You can have, rain at harvest, and it'll give the vines a drink, but you don't want it to be humid. So we can sort of manage a lot of those things now. And if you look at other parts of the world, crikey, Bordeaux in particular, 1 in 5 years is a disaster for them. Yep. As you know more about the conditions I have over there than I do, but I just know that they have a lot of botrytis issues, whereas we're quite lucky where we are. We're a cool climate region, and we can manage some of those flavours.
It's interesting, because I never think about Coonawarra in context of being a cool climate. I think about Adelaide Hills and what have you. I'd never really considered that before. That it's by contrast to McLaren, it's cooler, right? Yes. And definitely cooler than Barossa. Okay,
I'm not sure that. I mean, if you really want to talk cool climate, then you can go to Tasmania, or you can go to parts of Victoria, or you can go to the Alpine regions. Where timber,
Grampians and such. Yeah.
However, Coonawarra is very much an optimum climate, and one of the reasons that it is such a good region for what we do is the soil is a very large part of it. That is probably the biggest factor. The second factor is it's quite an optimal climate. It's got most of what you want. Grapevines, when you boil it all down, grapevines they like a not too fertile but well-drained soil. I don't like wet feet, and they obviously don't like it too fertile, but you're going to have enough to keep them growing.
Yeah.
And then they want cool, wet, cold winters and warm, hot, dry summers. I don't like summer rainfall. I mean, we can cope with it, but we don't like it. And then you've got to total in the diurnal variation, cool nights, warm days. Now, a lot of that is associated with the maritime climate, and even though Coonawarra is 100 kilometres from the sea, both to the west and the south, there are no mountain ranges or anything. We get sea breezes in the evening, so that they just turn up here an hour later or an hour and a half later.
All right, I'm getting heckled by.
There's plenty of days here when we can have days of 40 degrees, but when the sun goes down, you got a jumper on.
Yeah.
It's not that many days when not many nights when you don't need a light blanket or a sheet on you, because it gets a bit cool. One of the reasons that Singapore is the exact opposite. I mean, it's humid, which grapevines don't like, but your temperature's so even. Yeah. I mean, I was always thinking, it gets to 35 degrees and the taxi driver's telling me he's boiling. It gets to 31 and he's freezing.
I'm getting heckled by some of your more regular clients. They want to start drinking. So
don't tell them stuff. Bruce, talk about the 06.
Yeah. Let's start with that. Bruce, would it be fair to say that if you to take Majella Shiraz, cherries, cedar, chocolate, would those be the three drivers that might maybe define your Shiraz over the vintages? Would that be something that's overriding?
Yeah, we certainly get some. So spice, you get herbs and spice. So I'll see cinnamon and cloves. The older one, the 06, I see a little bit of nutmeg in it now as it's starting to develop.
It's changing in the glass. I mean, I opened mine an hour and a half ago, maybe, and decanted it 4 hours ago.
Yes.
And it's extraordinary, and it's doing exactly what I remember these older Magellas do, was they just evolve and unfurl in an incredibly impressive way. I think on the noses, for me, the 13 was fresher on the nose than the other two, but I was really interested by how 6 was. It was quite sort of linear and quite aggressive initially, but that's now muted down. And as you say, the spice component has come out of it in such a good way.
Oh, it certainly is.
Keep going, Bruce.
Oh, yeah, I think really when you're looking at the closures, there's a lot to do with that now. Obviously, we have reliability out of our screw caps, and they're certainly slowing the aging process down. You spoke earlier about the potential for aging on our tasting notes, and they'll certainly go well past their 10 years. I agree with that.
It's true.
But they are softer. Like I see if the tannin is softening on the 06. I look at that, it's got a nice palate structure now. It's not hugely tannic in any stretch of way, so it's not drying out, is what I'm saying. It's still, and that to me is the beginning of the end of a wine. If they start drying out and they get a little bit lean, that still has some nice texture. It's a beautiful length to it. There's a little bit of, obviously you're going to get some tertiary flavours. You're going to start getting some secondary flavours. So I do see a little bit of the,
but you know what's quite cool about it, Bruce, is if you look at the average Shiraz at this price point from this part of the world, I think that the fruit is incredibly expressive and vibrant still. That's just about great winemaking in the beginning. That's a line that's still to manifest. There's none of that fortified fruit component that comes in at this stage with so many other wines. I think it's really not giving any of those telltale characteristics of coming to the end of a curve. I think it's showing really, really, really well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think because we're only picking from our own grown vineyard, we can manage and control what happens in the vineyard a lot more. That's certainly one thing from our point of view is an advantage. Obviously, winemaking. The winemaking hasn't changed of those 3 wines. It's exactly the same process, the same oak treatment. It's really, as Brian says, we're boring. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed at Majella, except we're a few years older and a little bit less hair. But it's really what we do is consistency, and that's what people can rely on. When you're looking at an older wine, that still has a long way to go, and it's got some beautiful texture to it, and it will drink well tonight and tomorrow night. The other guys that are going to be having them tomorrow night, they'll be drinking exceptionally well tomorrow night.
It's awesome how. Yep.
I was going to say, on top of Bruce talking about the closures, which are important, a couple of things that sort of have changed over the years, Bruce, certainly over the 50 years that I've been growing grapes. And one of the biggest is canopy management. Compared to 30 years ago, where we had very much the old Australian sprawl, big canopies, a lot of shading. We had a bit of trouble ripening. Nowadays, we do 1 or 2 green vendages, a side trimming in the year. I said once, someone once told me, I think it might have been old Jock Redmond, spend until Christmas, so allow for the Southern Hemisphere timing, spend until Christmas getting the canopy the way you want it to look, and spend the rest of the year just keeping it like that. So the balance is, as Bruce said, a natural physical ripening for which you need enough leaf. You don't want too much leaf, but you've got to have the right amount of leaf, and it's got to be functioning leaf that's photosynthesizing and doing all the things, so that you get a very natural physiological ripening curve if you plot it out. And if you can do that, you're 6 or 8 tenths of the way there. And you can deliver some great fruit to the winery. After that, they can work their magic on it and make it even a little bit better, perhaps. But at the end of the day, it all depends on what goes through the crusher.
So jumping from 6 to 13, I mean, that's a lifetime in terms of vine age, right? What hits me first up in terms of taking away the phenolics, just looking at the palate, is this dense, soft, multi-layering of texture in 13. It's really, really beautiful. You just want to lie back in it and enjoy it. It's fantastic. And certainly it, for me, it ticks the boxes above the 6 from that just one basic point, just the mouthfeel and the textural component of the wine.
Yep. I think that's a very fair comment. It's still a very youthful wine. The colour is still quite vibrant in the 13, so I was impressed by that. Certainly, it does have a lot of layers. There's no question. I see black fruits in there as well as some cinnamon. I see those sort of things. It's certainly a wine that has. Now we're starting to look at the palate structure. There's still some nice structure in the palate, so it's a very young wine by comparison. But as you said, it is a lifetime away when you look at 06 to 13.
It's interesting. If you line up the 3 together, there's no question. Maybe I'm a bit obsessed about wine glasses. I've nothing else to do but bloody polish my wine glasses these days. So I'm quite obsessed about that. They must smell right and they must, be clean properly. Yes. And what's interesting looking at through the glass is a certain oily cleanness about the 13 that's much better than the 6 and the 14. There's just in terms of the visual. It seems to be more finished, and there's a sort of there's definitely a deeper, richer, more resolved colour to the 13.
Yes. Yeah, that the colour is certainly quite refreshing to see for one that's got a bit of age to it. So I agree with that. It's evolving. I think now we're starting. I know there's only 1 year difference between 13 and 14, but possibly we're getting to a wine that's starting to turn through some complexity. And I could see possibly that could be this is the time. All wines turn at some point in time.
Yeah.
So I'd suggest
this to me, this seems to be a peak performance in terms of where it's sitting. There's this layering, and then also a sense of height to the wine. There's a poise and a balance to the wine that's just smack bang perfect right now. I'm really excited with how it shows.
Good.
Right now. Yeah.
I think the other thing, Robert, is that I think there is a lineal line you can draw through 14, 13 and down to 6. Pity we didn't have some others to fill in. I mean, the story for those people listening was that, we were talking getting some older wines, but we had to try and find some wines where we had a
some
little
volume.
bit left. But part of the problem is we generally sell out, Bruce, don't we? I mean, people.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
We don't keep enough back. Well, and when we do keep it back, we drink it. But I mean, there is a lineal projection down in that I think if you looked at 06 when it was made, or if you looked at 06 when it was just 6 years old and 7 years old, like the 13, the 14, you would see lots of similar characters. There would be different different little bits and pieces. But the overall picture of the wine, you would have said, yeah, that's pretty good. I mean, I think you've drunk enough Magellas, Robert, that you could put your nose into a glass and say, particularly if the Cabernet, when you look at it and say, well, that's good for a Cabernet, probably Majella, and rattle off a year and get it right.
No. Within a decade, it's about as good as I can get. And then I stuff it up more regularly than not.
You let me down, my friend.
What I wanted to, you talk about this consistency of approach through everything that you guys make. Has the mix of the oak changed at all? In terms of French and American blend, do you fiddle with that year on year, or do you feel it's
not year on year? But we've certainly over the last 10 years, we used to, in the early days, we were 100% American oak, and that was 50% new wood, and 25% second use, and 25% third use. We slowly waned from the 100% American oak to have 50% American oak and 50% French oak. Right. So these wines, I'll call the latter wines, so the three we're looking at tonight have actually got 50% French and 50% American in the new component, and then 25% second use and the third use.
Because
so we have been playing around with that a little bit, and we're doing more work now with American oak. I'm a big fan of American oak, I really am, but I think you can do a lot of work with American oak. And the Cooper that we use, our major supplier of our oak to us from the Barossa Valley, we've been working with them on American oak barrels just to get the firing that suits us. So
and you're sourcing American oak, is it all from one region in the States?
No.
Okay.
No, it's not. It's all on grain selection. So we're looking for tight grain, so slow growing. Right. And that'll come from different parts of America. So any of the wide grain really is bourbon barrels. So coarse grain and high firing. The barrels for American oak barrels that are for the wine industry are really tight grain, and they're very slow firing. So there'll be no charring.
It was super interesting talking to the winemaker from Silver Oak the other day. And it was interesting how I think he said that it's from 7 different parts of the US. And again, this tight grain obsession, and of course the price goes up. The tighter it gets.
Yes.
I had a long session with Peter John from AP Johnny at Cooper.
Oh yeah.
We went on some Canadian visitors and took them up to Tanunda, and they were fascinated. And Peter was saying that he can source very good American oak from the top of America to the bottom, all the way through, with different nuances and different flavours and different that, but all beautiful timber. So we are starting to see some really good differences. I mean, I like Bruce. I love American oak. I love American oak with Shiraz. I reckon that the two marry well. I really loved those old Shirazes we made first up, Bruce, in the 90s when it was 100% American oak. And I don't know, if I had my way, I would lean back to less less French and more American in our Shiraz. I don't know what you think, but I'd tend back that way. I'd drop it back a little bit to a third French and two-thirds American.
It's interesting because when you compare 13 to 14, the components of the coconut and the vanilla are definitely more evident in 13 than they are in 14. And that's an American oak tracer for me, rightly or wrongly. It's kind of, and so what I was interested in here was, given that if you're using the same kind of oak in both vintages, you're seeing an expression of it in a slightly more regal, slightly more overt form in 13 than you are in 14. And that's super interesting to see that.
So that really then comes down to the vintage variation.
Yeah.
So we're looking at, and because I said the vineyards are no different, the techniques in the winery are no different. We're using really only the subtle changes that you get from vintage, even down to the same yeast that we use in both those yeasts, and yeast can have a lot of variation when it comes to
that's a bit of a wild card then, isn't it, Bruce? Like, if that yeast it can go in any direction really, and it's quite hard to control. That's one of the scary parts of winemaking must be that that aspect.
I liken yeast to a very old comfy chair. It might be old, but you know exactly where the bumps are. So, and you can plan for those bumps. So I'm very rarely changing my yeast. And that applies to everything we do. And it's certainly one less problem you can have.
It would be interesting, Robert, picking up those little differences you've seen between 13 and 14. If we waited another 12 months.
Oh, game over, totally different.
You can probably look back if we did this in a year's time. You say, isn't it funny, in that 12 months,
what it's done.
We know that wines just don't actually go through this, they wax and they wane how they look, but then there's these little bumps in the middle, which is why I'm so interested in the damn stuff.
And also,
one of the reasons Majella is so boring in that we don't change very much. You can look at older vintages of Majella, knowing that the viniculture is very close to being the same. The viticulture is the same. It's the same vineyard.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a different year.
Yeah, but that's the cool thing about this.
But you're looking at what happened in that year. We haven't got lots of other variable factors that some other people might suggest. Did you change winemakers? Did you change yeast? Did you find a new oak supplier? Did you use a different fermentation technique? We are bloody boring. We just keep doing the same.
Well, that's why this tasting is so cool, because, as Bruce said, what you're seeing is a pure expression, certainly right now, a time capsule of how the vintages express differently from year to year. And that's really interesting for me. Bruce, do you think it would be fair to say that the 14 is on the mid to back palate, is showing a little bit more dryness or drying, maybe overt tannin compared to 13?
Yes, I do. I agree with that. Absolutely. That is certainly my observation when I saw that. And I think that there could be several reasons for that. Brian will pull me up if I get a bit boring, because I get a bit involved in it sometimes. But you can get in some years where you don't get the extraction rate out of the grapes. So you've got smaller berries with less juice, and so you get a higher concentration of tannin.
Right.
And I think that year, and I've got to go back and I'll have a look at my records for tomorrow night's conversation with regards to the extraction rates and see if there's some consistencies in the Cabernet on this. So the smaller the extraction rate, generally the higher the tannin structure you're going to get. So I'd be interested to see. But this, again, there's only 1 year's difference between those two wines, and this particular wine does have more tannin. It's a younger wine, even looking at it in the glasses.
Yeah, I'm trying to recalibrate for those 12 months to see how would this have looked a year ago.
I think that aged pretty slowly. I think it's always going to be a slightly more tannic wine. So just the drying out that we get, and you've got to be a bit careful. It's still a young wine. Crikey, it is only 6 years old. So
it was quite interesting. It was interesting reading James's analysis of these two vintages. he was certainly by ratings far more laudatory of the 14 than he was of the 13.
Yes.
But I think he used, I don't know if I actually saved his commentary because it was quite interesting. I can't bloody find it now. But he expressed almost a laudatory surprise at the way you handled the end of 14 to produce the quality that you have from 14 as a vintage. He was very impressed with how you got to it. He made some really good noises about it. Sorry, I didn't had it ready, and of course now I don't have it.
No, I can understand that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. But it was really interesting. He wrote, it was something to the effect that what you did in 14 was way and above what most people managed to achieve out of Coonawarra Cabernet in 14. So obviously he was making a point that there was some sort of aspect of your winemaking that was really clever in terms of knowing exactly how to deal with your grapes at the right time. And I guess that gets back to what Prof was saying earlier. The cool thing about Majella as a body of work is it's you since 1991. I mean, it's amazing. So it's your interpretation of harvest every single year. And so often with these big so-called super premium producers, it's almost like the John Stewart show. There's a guest every year, every night. And what's really nice is we're actually seeing your style and your approach and your interpretation of the varietal every time. It's very cool.
I think that's been a selling point of Majella for a long time. There wouldn't be too many Australian vineyards, certainly too many vineyards around the world, really. You can look at 30 years, or coming up 30 years.
Correct.
Of all the wines being made by coming from the same vineyard and being made by the same winemaker. Now, up until 99, they were made by Bruce and Brands. But when we built the Majella winery, we used the same regime. We copied the same vinicultural regime, and we always had our own oak regime anyway. So really nothing changed, did it, Bruce? It was just a bit cleaner and nicer and newer to work.
That's right, yeah.
And we were able to design it ourselves. and it's funny, this winery was, like I said, we first used it in 99. And I think Bruce would agree. We wouldn't change too much if we rebuilt it, Bruce, would we?
No, not at all. I think what we did, there may be one or two things as you often look at something and think, oh, maybe we could have gone that way with one sort of pipe or something else. But other than that, no. All the equipment we've got has been working very, very well. It's been very reliable and a joy to work in. So it's been great. It really has.
Well, this has been so insightful. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate that it's a little later in Oz. And tomorrow is a school day, although in Sydney, certainly in my experience in Sydney, school got out at about 12 o'clock on a Friday. So it's been more...
Tomorrow is the first day of school holidays.
Fantastic.
Not that it worries Bruce or I. No, we haven't got any children at school. I've got some grandchildren, which is the reason I'm going up to Adelaide tomorrow. So at the moment you're seeing me in my office, and tomorrow you'll see me in Adelaide.
Yeah.
But that really might make a difference. Someone dinging you for questions, are they, Robert?
Yeah. Anybody out there with some questions? Let me just read this one. If anyone has questions, just jump in now.
Because it's very boring, just you and me and Bruce chatting.
Yeah, geez. I always hope for some sort of Russian hacker to come in and I get promised all kinds of things about naked dancing girls, and we never get any of that in our food tastings.
Well, you really haven't put us down, Robert.
Just organise one. Stephen, take your gear off.
Easy, Tiger.
I'm loving your background screen there, mate. It's fantastic.
Well, I'm just looking at Wine Exchange. Bruce has got the best with the lineup of spoons.
Yeah, Bruce has got the absolute best one. But let me just see what this question is. Oh, there's somebody's asking, can you deliver a case of bubbles to my mum? Yeah, I'll take care of that for you, mate. It's somebody in Adelaide. We'll sort that out.
We can do that. The one thing I want to broach is that next year we'll try and do it. Tomorrow we're looking at 3 Cabernets. Which I know are interesting because the 6 Cabernet Bruce and I looked at, and I think it's fantastic. But As you know, we do a 10 vintage tasting here in Coonawarra every October. Next year, once everything clops up, I'm going to organise just 3 bottles of everything sent to you. I have no idea how we're going to structure it, Robert.
We'll figure it out, Prof.
People come along with a glass and pay some dollars and get a sip of each. And it won't be.
Well, as long as you, me, and Lou get one bottle, it'll be fine.
and it'll be. I don't know, how we do it, but I mean the way we do it in Coonawarra is that we've just got one long table.
Yeah.
And 3 or 4 of us are pouring bottles, and everyone goes along and tries all the wines, and then works out. Everyone has a different idea of what's best. But I'd love to do it in Singapore. I reckon it'd be great fun, and it's something that it'd be novel.
We've had a lot of interest from the last tasting when I promised Riddoch versus your G11, not G11. So
GP 68. Go on.
Yeah. Right. So there's I know. Sorry, I'm no good with numbers. Forgive me. But we've got a lot of interest in that. So we'll be annoying you in August about potentially doing a little side by side.
We are. Bruce and I are eminently annoyable. We're pretty good.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you tomorrow night. I'm looking forward to the Cabernets. Thanks so much. Take care, Bruce.
There, Robert.
Thank you.
Ciao, mate.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.